The older known descriptions say that man is not as he could be, due to him being misled by the mind and deluded by the senses. But a fuller up-to-date telling is that he has not suffered a mishap, but rather has succumbed as he ought to the opening rounds of the inevitable. And you see, the distinction then becomes that the few will not settle there. The external world is a reflection. The ordinary believe it is a reflection of something. The enlightened know that it is a reflection. Lost in the woods, the uncertainty of bearings. There is the way of the Sufi, the spirit of Zen, the life of the Tao, but the actual path tried by a real alive mystic is always uncharted, in that he returns himself and removes any breadcrumbs he may have previously dropped. Once upon a time, a man asked an undertaker, what specifically is the operational difference between the practice of the religions and the mystical endeavors? There are two, he replied. First, religion always has a preface, an introduction, a foreword, a setup. And secondly, religion always has a conclusion, a moral, a punchline. So, thought the man to himself, religion has it all over the mystical, coming and going. Few men have interest in exploring a building that has no clear entrance nor known exit. News for the home exterminator. Those seeking greater consciousness through freedom from the mind always, for some length of time, believe that there are bad roaches and not so bad roaches. They believe so in error. Home entertainment news. Reruns, 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 sputtered a man. All I get is reruns. But you don't even own a TV. I know that, he replied. The dangers and joy of the monastery are that it is easier to do it there than it is in the public square. The challenge: how to maintain a private retreat amidst the common crowd, whilst never forgetting that thou art the crowd. Before man is man, he is simple. Then with mind, he becomes complex. The original complexity is simple in form. Further enrichment is up to him. Over a campfire, nights cannot doze, nor idle thoughts fall and survive. Some chronological news. It's easy for a 20-year-old to believe he's discovered the mystical path, and easy for a 30-year-old to believe he's still on it, but now with a certain critical edge to his understanding. It sure is hard to find a 40-year-old still turned in the right direction with the unblemished enthusiasm and openness of a 5-year-old. A consumer's tip regarding your own home shopping network. A man who wants you to believe him doesn't have anything worth buying. To himself, said one man, there is but one possible way to explain the overall nature and ferocity of my thinking: anchovies. To make man move in his unique direction, life tells everyone that there is a secret to be discovered. But there is none, and therein lies its power. News of creative interest. Thus was struck one man one day: it's possible that a mystic is just an artist in someone else's clothes. And also, but a little less so, the other way around. During a routine passing time of internal turmoil, a certain man thought, I have wasted my life in attempting to awaken. And shit, I could have wasted it on something else. Should we make anything about the length of response to that one? To explain is to deny. The highest aspiration of ordinary minds is to be godlike. God to them representing the unchanging, the unmoving, the lifeless. Some additional how it goes news. Men have strength, women have beauty, and mystics have themselves. One guy finally turned to the operations of his mind and said, okay, what's the point? The true history of man as man resides not in books, but in consciousness. To respond is to resist, and to resist is to fall once again. After a distance along the way, the mind's sole deception is thought itself. The secret defended is the secret destroyed. The extent to which one who knows reveals his inner life. He goes to the brook to relieve himself. Why resist life when all that's needed is to resist your thoughts about life? Looking for the moment of awakening to come. Suns awaiting warmer days. The one that noted to explain is to deny. The history of man can be seen. First off, the history of man is always the civilized history of man. The history of man is always the ordinary history of man. The history of man is always the common history of man. The history of man is always the history of man as he is evolving mechanically. So the history of man, compared to the news item that says to explain is to deny, is considered that the history of man is one of a continual attempt to deny his baser instincts. Now, this is different from what I was talking about last time, to say that to think is to oppose life, and to think is to oppose life on the basis of the kinds of examples I was using that are everywhere of technology, civilization itself, that you are opposing the natural flow of life at the physical level, as witnessed by our ability, the drive for man to insulate himself from the environment to such a degree that he does not physically have to remove himself from time to time. The more civilized he is, that is, the more he has opposed life, that is, the more he has thought, which we'll bring it up to Western Europe, Western civilization, most of the world, that now, the more he is civilized, the less he has to acclimate himself to the natural flow of the environment. But now I'm talking tonight about something different. At least you mistake the two. Tonight I started out with to explain is to deny. It runs a very kind of unexpected parallel with the former, with my last one about opposing life, that thought is opposing life. But there is another sidetrack to this that is to explain is to deny. And part of the process running at the same kind of tempo to man becoming civilized and becoming less victim, less subject to the whims of the environment and the wind and the rain and food, of course, that he can now, he's not limited by the seasons. He can grow under all sorts of conditions. He can grow under artificial light. He can store, he can preserve. But there is another track of this running that is a continual denial of part of man's instinct, part of man's physical life. Parts of all religion, just to offer the easy institutional example, the public example, is a denial of man's of man's less than intellectual instincts. It is the basis of all common morality. Anytime it's morality outside the silent, operational kind that someone might exercise where they are a little more conscious, but the kind that is codified, the kind that is stated that thou shalt not do so and so. It is all a denial in part of man's, and the easy one being, the first one that's everywhere, is his sexual instinct. That all religion, all morality, what's the first thing they're going to holler about? Unless it was bankers who were running religion, and then it would be morality having to do with theft, of course, just to show. I'm just trying to show you how it can shift. That was not to pick on bankers. But notice what it is. What is the heart of all religion? If you heard about a new religion that you had never heard of, the Gracchofon religion, and you went, well, I've never heard of it, and they said, well, it's been held secret, and it has very distinct codes of morality and conduct like any good religion. And if they said, can you guess one of the main denials, one of the first prohibitions? If you've got any sort of even just walking up and down the street sophistication, you can take just a shot in the dark. So, well, let me guess. I bet they've got a whole bunch of rules about sex. And they go, you have heard of it. And may I now pull us out of the example of religion. It is civilization itself. It is the march of progress, not just along a horizontal line going from one spatial place to another, but in a kind of vertical line moving up man's nervous system collectively and individually. He's being dragged along, but collectively the march goes up this way, and the higher it goes, the more there is a kind of denial of the older part. You can look at beyond the areas of morality and religion, all of the judicial system is a kind of denial with prohibitions, the kinds that they can exercise now. The religions have to say, well, God will get you after you die. The state can say, we'll get you now. They're saying do not, well, the easy ones being are obvious to start off in the same area of sex, which is at the heart, as we all know, there would be no life without sex. But what is the first things religions, what are the first things that civilization have to attack? What do they deny in part? Now you understand I am using deny now in a wider sense. It is not to say, well, nobody can screw. It's not that, but they have to deny sex in its purest form, in its just blatant, right in your face form. There has to be, all right now, here's religion speaking, here's civilization speaking, that, well, yes, we've got to engage in sex. You have to do that. But, and then it starts a process of denial. Like, well, we can only do it under these conditions. You can't do it. That is what I mean by denial. And I could have used a whole bunch of words, but they're just words. I selected that one for a real reason. They do not prohibit sex. I know that some strange cults do, but they are self-defeating themselves because they deny sex. You got to join now, or I started to say another generation, they won't be here. Which I guess is one of the safer statements a man can make. They deny sex in the sense that unbridled sex would be detrimental to the development of man's intellect. It would be detrimental to the orderly progression, the orderly run of society. We would never have gotten around to the point of being able to think and oppose life to the degree of coming up with technology and being able to remove ourselves from the captious, capricious hands of nature, so to speak, if we were all that simplistic. If we were still driven by, I keep saying baser instincts, I know it has a negative connotation sometimes now, but the physical, the bowel survival instincts. Sex, which has no mind, except for those of you who know the kind of Alabama joke is about where do an Alabama boy's brains reside. It has something to do with the head, but it's not the head on your neck. But rather than say Alabama, that is the fair description of the simplistic of the world. And as you all are quite aware, even though we speak of the world now being more or less civilized, it is still a kind of spectrum to where we have different time zones, and there are areas of the world, as I pick out sometimes using Alabama, but there are countries or whole areas of the world that are less civilized, which is not a sociological criticism of the people. They are simply driven still more by the bio survival instincts than they are the intellect. But they are the same crowds of people. We do not have to look for islands in the South Pacific. All you've got to do is go on the right side of town wherever you live. And there they are. Everyone knows that. Nowadays, part of being civilized, recall, I gave you a new definition of how you can tell really civilized people. And I just picked out one example, but it's exactly what I'm referring to now, is one way you can tell that a peoples are truly civilized, that they will no longer call the stupid, stupid. It becomes you have to think up new descriptions of it. And that is exactly what I'm talking about, but they are always within our midst, and if you don't, like I said, and I'm sure most of you do not want to travel to the South Pacific, for instance, trying to find such a group that is further behind in the evolutionary process, so I point out that they're in your hometown. But some of you may not care to go across town. So, take off your clothes and stand in front of a full-length mirror, and there, somewhere up and down, your old nervous system is people just as uncivilized as you could ask for. You have got trailer parks somewhere right in your nervous system. You have got Alabama. You have got Lower Slobovia in your own nervous system. But there's an area that I'm trying to get at that is really sticky to describe. Look, we've got to get this picture. That right now, somewhere on this planet, imagine, there's a tribe of people somewhere on an island somewhere. We all know this. It's no big news that are just barely on the peripheral of civilization. There are people who are, as far as they can tell now, that everybody on this planet has some language. And they're not in the Stone Age, and they have a wheel, and they have fire. But there are people still out living in the South American jungles and Africa and parts of Asia, that they are still nomads. They just have rudimental ideas about grain. Anyway, you know that there are people much less civilized than you are in St. Louis. Why do I have to figure out the beer capital of America? But anyway. Who said likes attract? If you understand that, in a sense, civilization is obvious that if we're going to look at a less civilized group of people, just some people living out in the jungle somewhere in the Amazon, and just barely civilized, is compared to people living in a metropolitan area, the rest of the civilized places all over the world. It's not just the technology. You know that they have a different attitude toward life. They have their civilization, we can call them civilized, that they have, if they're holding together at all, if it's any tribe of people, they have rules, regulations, taboos. They have their own kind of civilization. So when they're closer to the kind of bio-survival level, at first your mind might think, if I said, in which area would you have the strongest denial, if you're following what I mean by that, of the lower areas of man? And at first you might think, well, it would be there because they're more in touch with it. They would have more rules against the kind of violent, crude, uncivilized, simplistic behavior that would seem to be indicative, your mind would say, of that kind of person. You understand, the lower they are in the development of civilization, in some sense of morality, and etc., you would think, well, the more prohibitions, the more their mythology, the more their folklore, the more their tribal rules and regulations would have to deny and try and suppress it. Now, doesn't that make sense? As opposed to the more civilized. Because more civilized people, you would think that by its own definition, if not connotation, the more civilized you are. Think about it. a nice Harvard professor, you don't have to have the same kind, you would think, that whole community, say around Harvard, just picking out, that you would not have the same sorts of tribal, speaking of that as being some tribe, some locale, same kind of tribal prohibitions, the same kinds of strict regulations over their morality as you would this group of just barely civilized people going around half naked, living in the jungle somewhere. Right? But is that so? No, it's not. Now, it's not quite as simple as I can, in some way, if I was here trying to make a point and try to say you something, that I can prove it historically, sociologically, statistically. You just got to be able to listen and you can hear it. They have less, in the less civilized areas. Now, we can take the less civilized area right in St. Louis, right in Minneapolis, right in New York, wherever you are. And it's the same situation, except then if I put it into one central locale or one common locale, such as naming cities in the United States. And most of the cities, we've got federal laws and et cetera. Most of the state laws track the federal laws, and so there's not that much difference between what goes on in Miami as to what goes on in Oklahoma City or Buffalo. But with inside those same areas, that is, you've got laws applying to everyone who lives in Buffalo. But you do know if you live in Buffalo and you live in a civilized part of town, just a regular middle class, at least part of town, there are parts of that town that almost could be that jungles of Amazon or of Africa or a South Pacific island. Everybody knows that. We have to think up new terms for it, the more civilized, but you know that. So even though the same laws are applying, you do know that as far as it is functional, the operations of it, they act as though they do not. But it's the very places. I was afraid that might get too sticky. Let's go back. It's the same thing, but let's go back now to Buffalo, civilized, or Harvard, and back to the forest somewhere in the somewhere out in the jungles of a less civilized people. Like the less civilized, they're living closer to the bowel survival instincts. They're living closer to sex. They're walking around naked. They have to kill food every day to eat. It always turns out that they are bloodthirsty in exercise insofar as intertribal battles compared to civilized people. But always rumors of cannibalism, always to give people shudders. But it would seem that though their whole life, just the whole definition, covers it actually being less civilized. You know that they have, just immediately, if I start saying, well, describe less civilized, or what you look at those people, see a little 30-second or minute film clip of them running through the jungle and they're all dressed up and painted weirdly. And if I said, trying to describe what uncivilized, or what would you imagine that group of people? And you'd start saying, well, they're probably very lascivious. They have no probably sense of morality. I bet sex is just rampant among everybody. And you'd always have a safe guess, probably just look at them and what few clothes they had on, you'd probably see some things that look like human skulls. And you'd think, I bet they're all... Well, you just know that they're not governed by a strong sense of morality of thou shalt not kill, and it's a big deal, you can't hit people, that's known as assault. You just figure, you just know damn well that out there that they just be wandering through the jungle, and if one guy, stepped on another guy's foot, he might pick up a rock and just kill him. And just wander on along, forget about it. You're just sure of that, and it's based on reality. And so you would think, based upon the fact that and it is a fact, that life is expanding everywhere. If it turns out that it is down a dead end, whether it be in St. Louis or Buffalo or in some fictitious South Sea island, they become dinosaurs. But other than that possibility, then life is growing and expanding everywhere, and hence, even at the places less civilized, there is an expanding sense of civilization. That they are being ignited in their nervous system higher and higher up from the sex organs and the belly. Just the bowel survival is getting higher. But as it gets higher, even as they're struggling to do it, even life is pushing through it. And I said, well, who would have the widest sense, collectively speaking, that is their local tribe, their local civilization, who is going to be suffering from the greatest sense of denial to that kind of base life energy? And at first you would think, well, those people, because they need it the most. If they're going to evolve, then they're the ones. It's like children. You got to give children more rules and regulations. If you're an adult, you're supposed to know better by then, right? Yeah, it all sounds right. But who has a stronger, in a sense, and stronger, put that in 4 or 5 sets of quotation marks, who has a stronger, wider spread, more invasive sense of denying that kind of biosurvival level energy? It is the more civilized. The more civilized you are, the more there is a denial of the past. The more there is a denial of, which is what? Sex, greed, homicidal tendencies, everything that is animal, everything that is not intellectual in man, is that which has to be more strongly denied, seen to, in the civilized than it does those less civilized. There is no, as I've said, no psychological, sociological, historical point to this, to that. It's for you to realize in yourself that life does not go in the same direction that the mind says it is going. And that man is made in his nervous system to deny the very things in his past, the very things in his present that can keep a man from seeing what's going on. All explanation is denial. Now, besides, again, let me distinguish from last time, because apparently a lot of you got something out of it at the time when I was saying that to think is to oppose life. And to oppose life is to progress, in a sense, technologically. Well, it's to progress all the way, but I was using technology as the example of struggling against, opposing the indigenous flow of nature, of life itself, at the physical level. But then once man is a mental creature, he is now set up with the responsibility of denying in a different way. And the denial is as subtle as me describing the opposition to life is actually the technological progress of man. That in a more subtle, or at least equally subtle and elusive manner, is that the explanation is that man is denying parts of life every time he explains, and other than the physical changes man has wrought on the environment, everything else he has done mentally, everything else he's done other than physical by his mental capacities, has been a form of explaining life. Once you get past all technological adventures, then everything else is an adventure in the intellect solely, normally referred to philosophy, religion, all the arts. They become attempted explanations of life. And those pursuing such certainly would not take it as an insult. Philosophers especially would say, well, certainly that's what it is. Well, it's always been. It's what the religious of anything above the most crude and simplistic level, even the religious would say, well, yes, that's what religion is they would want to attribute it to revealed words, or that God himself has tried to send down information to help man, to help explain life. All explanations are denial. We can jump in, at least for a second, into the kind of areas I know that more interest you. It's exactly why the moment, why the enlightenment, the awakening, that's why it cannot be explained. It's not because of stupidity. And after thousands of years of interested parties hearing other, they believe, past interested parties say, well, you can't describe it. And they can grab that and just run, I mean, like a tailback on about 14 different kinds of drugs, and it doesn't know which way to go. But you can grab that ball and just run anywhere, and it momentarily feels good. Because you think, well, I don't know, it's just so strange, and it is so non-revealing. When the rest of life always says, well, this is very revealing, we can tell you exactly what's going on, and you've already been through it all, and you know they can't. And then you hear some term, Sufism, the Tao, mysticism in general. And it says, and it's after this one point, it's some kind of other whole new stage of being internally, and God, it's something, and it goes, but All of those who've ever had it, they all say one thing in common, no matter Chinese, Japanese, Indian, German, Italian, Argentine. They all say one thing in common. Yeah, what is that? They say, it cannot be described. And at first, many people, almost everybody, wired up to even go through that much. They want to grab it and go, yeah. Because at least it's sort of open-ended. Because if it tells you exactly what it is to start with, you can resist it. I was jumping way ahead, hundreds, thousands of either hours, minutes, months in your life. That the reason it can't be explained is not anything all of that complex. It's not anything that esoteric. It cannot be explained because there's nothing to be explained. Explanations are everything that stands between you and the experience. Wait a minute, could I write that down? Does anybody catch the subtle beauty of it? The captious beauty of it? That the mind itself, and I can now include all physical progress, all technological progress, but the mind itself, if there would be any description worthy of its operations, would be what? It's in charge of attempting to explain things. Sex organs do not have to explain anything. A man's sex organs, they do not get in a certain agitated state, and a man say, well, my God, what is this? And you have to converse with your sex organs for it to say, well, or your stomach. You hear these noises, and it's not English if you're English, or you recognize it's not Italian if you're Italian, but do you have to have it explained to you? Do you have to have somebody explain to you as a kid that you're hungry? Do you have to have somebody explain to you that you're cold? Even if you're a kid and can't do anything about it, a baby, you shiver. The body needs no explanations. The body's relationship to the wind, that is to life, needs no explanation. It flows right with it. The body sees. I know I have to do this, but some of you can follow it by now, even though the body is not conscious in the sense we talk about being conscious. The body is in complete agreement with life and needs no explanation. If it needs explanation, it shows one thing, that you are physically, genetically flawed and you're not going to live, or you're not going to live as a human. That is, that's being crippled. That's being in some way malformed genetically. It just simply is. Because if you are just reasonably middle class, middle of the road, healthy, normal person, the body needs no explanation, which is why it's funny to talk about, you don't have to have somebody, you call your mother over and say, listen to this noise in here. What does it mean? Is my stomach speaking in tongues, as fundamentalist Protestants would say in the South? You don't need anybody to explain. The body is in complete harmony. The body senses no distinction between itself and life. The body fits my description in the past between a fish and water. A fish cannot have water explained, and if it could, it would kill it, because then the fish would be separate from the environment. It is not that man has run amok somewhere. But notice I point out tonight that the classic descriptions, and they still go on, they're repeated not only in religion but in all would-be mystical literature. They're attributed to Lo and Buddha and everybody, that the descriptions is that man is not as he could be. Religions, of course, say should be. It's the same thing, but even in a less of a stringent religious sense, the descriptions always pointing out that man is not as he could be because he has, and then there's all sorts of specific stories like original sin, but what they're actually saying when they rise a little above that kind of simplistic level is they're saying he is not as he could be because he's been misled, he's been deluded. Now we're not talking about religion now and the old hairy one and Satan. He's been deluded by his mind. And that sounds as though it's a step forward, which I guess it is. If you got that much time that you start off in St. Louis, and we've got to get from St. Louis to the sun on this mystical journey, just to use. So yeah, that's a step forward, if that makes you feel any better. You take it from there, but how much good that does. But at any rate, verbally, you could say it's a step forward. But you see, the very thing that is man's possible, that is man's entree to a different level, is the very thing to which the mind attributes all of its ills. If man did not have the mind, he could not say whether anything was wrong or not. You understand? The body cannot speak. The body is either in operational, beneficial, functional agreement with life. Whatever's going on. You simply are, or you're news. You are simply in agreement with life enough to stay alive, or you don't. If we were in less civilized, physically speaking, less civilized circumstance, and you're out there having to hunt for food every day and find a secure, health-supporting place to stay every night, you either do it or you don't. But if we were back at that level to play with it again, the body has no consciousness to speak, and the body's got no complaint. The body's got nothing to explain. If you're laying there starving, you're about to die. The body, your stomach, wouldn't wish that a priest or a rabbi or somebody would come by, or a good Samaritan, even if it's too late to save you. Your body wants to explain, I'm dying. There's nothing to explain. The body either survives or it does not survive. You get above that level, you have the mind now attempting to explain life, and all the explanations, in a sense, are a denial of life. They are a denial of life if we draw my level of consciousness. It is, in a sense, remember, denial I'm not using as either or. I'm not saying, it's not that the mind says the body doesn't exist and the rest of it. Oh, yes, it exists, but they have to deny it on the basis of we cannot let it go unchecked. The mind does not say, well, sex doesn't exist or anger doesn't exist. Oh, yes, it knows quite well it does. And it thinks, well, part of my job is to explain it, to understand it, study psychology, study sociology, study history, so we can explain this to ourselves and, by God, pull ourselves together here and get our act together. How many cliches can we come up with? Pull ourselves upright, zip up our pants, pull our boots on, straighten up our capes, get our minds together, get the right attitude, and by God, get out there and do it. But all of that is what they're saying is we have got to deny. Remember now the full sense of deny. We have got to deny the power of the past. We have got to, we know it's there. The mind will always admit that. The more sophisticated, the more that a person is intellectual. Back to my example, if we moved into the area of Harvard as opposed to a group of people out in the jungles, the guys at Harvard, those at the further extreme of the civilized spectrum right now, they are the ones who would most readily agree that, oh yes, we have certainly not weeded out the baser, more barbaric instincts in man. Oh no, we've got a long way to go. And you think, well, at first, yeah, that makes sense. They're the ones that should say that. But it's not that simple. Because then you move over either to the jungles I'm talking about, or else to the other side of Boston, over to the worst neighborhood. And there's the ones who need it, and they've got less a sense of morality than the Harvard professors. You understand? It is a justice at work. It is due to the nature of what the mind perceives to be a dual reality. It has to continually try and deny the past, rephrase it, come up with a new description, and it doesn't matter. It is all a sense of denying because it's all a sense of explaining. Even while saying that this had nothing to do with psychology, sociology, and etc. Let's move it out of the area wherein it could even have the appearance. What are all of the mystical traditions? We don't have to make any even assumed or insinuated criticism. Just take them as they are. What are people attempting to do? What have they always been attempting to do? Well, at first, you would want to say, I'll go ahead and do it because I know sometimes I can ask a question in such a broad manner after all this wandering here and there, and you're not quite sure. It's not that you don't know some possible response or but you're not quite sure what the hell, what was it? I heard the words, but which question? It's like we've already circled around the earth 4 or 5 times, and then I suddenly say, okay, well, how about it? And you think, well, yeah, well, I know. All right. Above the most rudimental level of religion, into the real areas of what religion, philosophy, the human spirit, the human mind is about, if you ask somebody, but especially those who believe that they're involved with a quest for the great mystical adventure, to be able to actually find the place and to do it. If they were pressed, or just if you ask, well, how would you explain? We're not trying to make you overspeak your own experience. It's not whether you've actually had what the moment of enlightenment, if you want to say that, because if you have, you know it. Anybody, in case some of you, I've never said this, but it's nothing new. In case you have any doubt, like, have I actually been fully awake? If you got any doubt, no. It doesn't mean that what you had was not something, or else why you're still pursuing it. But there's no doubt when you have it, there's just nothing else to say. But if somebody, we'll assume that everybody is, well, at any rate, anybody who had less than the full one, that if you say, well, just based upon what you have had, based upon what you understand, based upon what, just everything about, that we were speaking to somebody and treating them as a sincere, would-be mystic kind of thing. And so what do you think is the point of, Satori and enlightenment and the illumination and the great awakening? I mean, what is it, do you think? And with just a little prodding, everybody, like I said, somewhere above the tribal level, somewhere above the most rudimental, like fundamentalist religious level, that someone who believes that the reality in religion, the reality of the idea of a great secret mystical tradition is something. If nothing else, it is something regarding now. It's something regarding this life. It's got nothing else to do with sometime else and someplace else. Then if you say, well, what is it? What do you think is the point, or what do you think would be the payoff of being enlightened? And any person above the most simplistic level, no matter what part of the planet they were on, and no matter whether it was 5,000 years ago or last week, I assure you it all will come down to, that is, the higher they are up, just mechanically up the nervous system, is going to say, well, the point is to understand why we're here, or to understand life. They always want to, most people make it real personal, like to understand why I'm here. But it's to understand life. The point is, they will use the term somewhere, understand. It's to understand, or to know. I don't mean to play with words. I say I want to know what life is. Then, to hear followed that up, if I said, well, good. And if I said, well, would you consider that, in other words, you want life explained? Yes. Well, that's what, I'm not playing with words again. If they say, well, what I want to know is to understand life. So I said, well, in other words, you want life explained. At least you want to understand so that you can, it's explained to you. Yes. That's why the experience cannot be explained. Yes, but there's got to be some great secret or some trick in that. Oh, no. That's it. That's the trick. That's the secret. Except to ever get going, you think, well, what I want is an explanation. I mean, that is about as good as you can do in English. If someone was attempting, if someone knew what was going on, and for some reason they decided to try and do something publicly and had to make, you've got to call it something or put out some kind of advertising slogan or say, lecture on the possibility of being a better person or being more, or just push it right outright and say 20th century version or 20th century lessons or lecture on the awakening, the Enlightenment. And you'd have to say something like, and if somebody showed up, or you'd have to put some kind of little slogan in the ad like, the awakening explained. Yeah. The Enlightenment explained for modern man. What it is to be more consciously awake, a lecture and explanation. You've got to call it that. And then you've got to apparently talk about it in some way or the other. All of you are familiar, I assume, it's got to be one of the, no particular significance to this, but just to get us into it, it's got to be one of the most misperceived pictures, parables, metaphors, and all the mystical literature. And it's seeped far from just mystical literature. It's part of common culture, almost. But anyway, the picture of some monastery somewhere, some school of meditation, some mystical school, it's a common picture all over the world of some older teacher, some older monk hitting the younger ones. All the way from a very simplistic thing that you're attempting to sit there and meditate in a certain way 14 hours a day, and if you seem to nod off, he'll hit you. That's the crude version. That's the Southern Baptist version of Zen, say. A more up-to-date version, a more civilized version, is like the koans of asking a question, and you say, well, what's so-and-so? If that's up, where's down? And the student goes, and he hits him. That has got to be, and it's not just, I didn't mean just limited to Zen, there's stories in the Christian mystical literature and Sufism, it's everywhere. If somebody goes to study somewhere, and it will, all you got to do is to read 2 or 3 pages of history and lore from that particular school, and it will get into stories of teachers hitting, striking interested parties that you show if you're a grown person. You're not a kid. It's not somebody hitting you because you spit up your food. We're talking about grown people trying to become more enlightened and etc. And it's full of these stories that there they are doing their best, giving up their life. And suddenly, one of the older guys, the guy that they thought they were studying from, he asked him a question, or they respond in some way, and he hits him. As I was suggesting to you, that has got to be one of the most misperceived allegories in the world, because I'm going to tell you what it actually represents. It represents internally one of the approaches of a man handling thought. A man handling his own thinking. I could have predicted that would get a pretty good response. But now, if you just leave it there, your mind just immediately assumes, well, that is showing some sort of resistance, some sort of opposition to thinking. Because then you would take that, well, what? That's some kind of either method you thought you had read about, or maybe you thought you'd come up with yourself, or maybe you think I'm hinting at. Like, well, you have all these bad roaches. These bad thoughts show up in your house, and you step on them. You resist them. And you don't know how close that is to religion. You don't know how close that is back to the jungle. Because if you resist thought, and I'm not going to try to pull it out but you can look back and find Moses, Jesus, Buddha, Lao, everybody speaking about trying to wrestle with tar babies. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the 19th century Georgia. Wrestling with evil spirits, that was some of them. Trying to drive evil spirits from your house. I think that was one of Jesus's, that you better watch it, because even if you go through some kind of magical and mystical things and you drive out 10 evil spirits from your house, and you think, ha-ha. Maybe you go out and have a beer or something, you come back, and they're 26. I've never heard of some, but I can just imagine a good Southern Baptist with a couple of good shots of gin and getting hold of that and turning into numerology and astrology. But I'm going to tell you what it is. It's the point, there is no way to attack thought head on. To attack thought head on is the mother of all, forgive me, Dr. John, losing battles. It is the mother of them. All attempts to explain life, all attempts to explain thought are futile. And yet you start off and there has to be apparently a structure, something to do. And it's represented, the most common one, or one of the most common, is this old man, some teacher striking a student. But then look, what is all religion? I've told you, it is a denial of a certain process, a certain aspect of life. And most of you, for the first 30 or 40 minutes, seem to have thought you got something out of that to be civilized, in a sense, you do have to deny sex, for instance, at its most pure form. There would be no Harvard Oh, we could build the buildings, but who would go to class if everybody was out screwing out on the square? And then, you can't do it. Out on the commons just everywhere, which is real common. You can't do that. You have to deny it in a sense. And you have to deny the urge to eat just to satisfy your hunger anytime you want to, or there would be. It's a sad picture to consider, but there it is in the cafeteria in Harvard. The head of the philosophy department walks past the head of the theology school, who has a nice, a nice fresh hot cross bun on his tray, and the head of the philosophy department just grabs it. I mean, who wants to picture? Well, I know it kind of takes the spirit out of me, but who wants to picture two men of their rank in life down in the floor wrestling over a hot cross bun? That is what I mean. It's not just sex. I was assuming all of you had the point that the more civilized you are, the more you have to deny that certain kind of lower level, the biosurvival instinct in man. But you get here and the mind says it's otherwise, that I am not now denying anything. I am searching. I am attempting to explain life. It's not so. Every explanation. Now, we're not talking about ordinary men. Ordinary men are doing exactly as they should. And those stories are just right on the money. The old descriptions that, well, the reason that man is not what he should be or could be is because he's been deluded by the mind. God, I still don't, I worry about you people underappreciating life. Because once you hear that and you think, well, now that's a better description. Now we're getting somewhere. That's not the old idea that Satan has got us around the short hairs or choking us and got us hypnotized. You're right. It's our own mind deluding us. Huh. Man is the only creature that can be held in captivity with nary a need for a bar or a chain anywhere. All you got to do is tell him, no, you're not a captive. Now, you may think you are. And your forefathers thought you were a captive and sort of held back because of evil forces and Satan. Now, we're too sophisticated. The only thing holding you back from your own internal development and enlightenment or whatever is your own mind. I mean, not operating efficiently. The delusion caused by your own mind and senses. And you think, now. Life did not have to put man on some island, did not have to put up bars, because you're doing the very thing that you're supposed to now. Now we've got to go back from ordinary people. That's ordinary people doing as they should. And you've all done it, that you hear description, and it sounds as though it is progress. It sounds as though it is a more revealing description to hear that, all right, the reason that men are not all they could be, the reason that they're not even what they should be, and everybody goes, yeah. It's because of the mind. The way in which your own mind, well, not your fault, of course, because you got the sins of the fathers and et cetera, and the traumas, but it's because of the delusion of your own mind and senses. And you hear it, and you think, that is progress. I was too far. I'm not going to believe it's some old hairy Satan or some guy with hooves or some evil spirit. That's it. The explanations are getting better. What? Yeah. Every explanation, and I'm not making conditions. I didn't put a parenthetical. I did not put an asterisk. Mysticism, the Enlightenment itself, is no exception, contraire. But to say, well, all descriptions are denials. All explanations are denials. There's none to say after that, which is why you keep talking. I mean, you start out and you could tell people, does everybody believe the train is about to leave? And everybody go, yeah. Of course, you could say, well, hey, do you believe it probably has already left you? And then everybody go, yeah. But anyway, that was a little ending humor, see, because I'm assuming you people are a little beyond that. But you say, would you believe that the train, if I say the train is about ready to go, and everybody go, oh yeah, there's no doubt, I'll be surprised. I'm just thankful that the great mystical choo-choo may have waited for me. And so you say, all right, and then what do? You got people who go, all right, I'm listening. What are you going to do? It's like kids going to camp. And this is not an insult to you, this is what everybody goes through. But it's like then you can spend what? And nobody knows, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years of you then apparently going through the short list of instructions like, all right, now you got all your bags. Yeah. And you really want to go. Yeah. You don't know how repetitive it gets. I know sometimes you think you do. And then you say, now you sure you got your ticket? Yeah. Now you sure you want to go? You sure you want to go because it could be leaving? Yeah. And that can go on for what? A lifetime. But what's the person who's hollering, all right, the train's ready to go. Are you ready to go? Yeah. See, there is where some of the old Zen stories, that's the new version, I guess I just made up on the spot, is what it should be. All right, I'll make it up on the spot. Here's a brand new one, brought into the 21st century. Zen teacher standing at the platform hollering, train to enlightenment, ready to go. A bunch of people show up, and he goes, are you ready to go? And they'll go, yeah, and he hits them. That's it. And so maybe they calm, all right, then they calm down for a little while. And he waits a day, an hour. And he says, all right, the train is really still there, and you're thankful, at least he's still talking to him. And he says, all right, have you got your baggage? And you go, yeah, and he hits you again. Then another 5 years, he says, did you wear clean underwear? Yeah. And it seems as though, well, I got to be getting somewhere. Well, I'll end it with my own last one for the night, was awaiting for the enlightenment to come amounts to sons awaiting a warmer day.